2018, our world is dealing with nothing less than the survival of our species. Nuclear war, terrorism, poverty, violent conflict, disease. In Washington, where we would hope leaders are busy finding solutions to these global challenges, our politicians seem barely able to sit in a room together. We hear more about their bickering over a memo or an earmark or the latest case of sexual misconduct than we do about their efforts to exercise joint leadership, to reform healthcare, find common ground on gun control, or solve climate change. Sadly, the challenge isn't just in Washington. The dilemma is global. In its worst manifestations, when politicians succumb to their ego or self-interest, societies have been dragged into decades of violent conflict. In those moments, it seems that those men and women are incapable of exercising leadership. What happened to Mandela, or Lincoln, or Mother Teresa? Women and men who remind us that at moments in time, true leadership existed. Fortunately, such leaders do exist today. I know because I've spent the last 17 years learning from them. In the field of peace building, you can often find ordinary people who, when faced with overwhelming challenges, do the extraordinary. Let me tell you a story about my friend Faba and her colleague Lema. It was in the early 2000s, and Liberia was in the midst of a horrific civil war. Unthinkable violence, including the maiming and conscription of children, widespread campaigns of rape and forced abductions, were being carried out by both rebel forces and President Charles Taylor's army. Faba and Leba, unable to stand the protracted trauma the violence was wreaking, got together to form the Christian Women's Peace Initiative. Their goals were simple and desperate. They were sick and tired of the killing and raping of their children. The violence had to stop, but their leaders were part of the problem. So they began to mobilize. They started with a few women from their church, but within 2 months, they had motivated women from nearby mosques to create Muslim Women for Peace. By April 2003, just 10 months later, they'd formed Liberian Women Mass Action for Peace, which brought together groups from throughout the capital and thousands who'd been displaced from the countryside. They took the audacious risk of holding massive peaceful protests right under the nose of Charles Taylor. They kept their message united and apolitical. We, the Liberian women, are sick of the killing of our people. We want peace. No more war. Every morning, they sat in a field across from the fish market in central Monrovia, right on the main road that President Taylor passed on his way to Parliament. As attention to their protests grew, so did his threats to have them killed for embarrassing his administration.
Charles Taylor said, "Those who think they can come out in the street to embarrass themselves, come out. I'm waiting for you." I said nobody, N-O-B-O-D-Y, nobody will get into the street to embarrass my administration.
We were not afraid. My mother was like, they will beat you people or they will kill you. And we said, well, if I should get killed, just remember me that I was fighting for peace.
After months of growing protest, President Taylor finally agreed to meet with them. The strength of thousands of women united in their message compelled both the president and the rebel leaders to attend peace talks in nearby Ghana. To hold them accountable, the women followed them. And when the government and the warlords realized that they could continue to orchestrate the war from their cushy hotel rooms, the women brought their protest inside. They sat down on the floors outside of the doors to the negotiation rooms and blocked the men in. When the men realized and tried to force their way out, Lema evoked an old insult thought by some across West Africa to be a curse. She started to strip naked. Shocked, and probably scared, the men re-entered the negotiation room and began negotiating the final peace agreement in earnest. The women of Liberia flipped the paradigm. Against a violent dictator, they took back power. They enacted leadership. For their courageous activism, Lema won the Nobel Peace Prize. Their story may seem incredible, but I have known dozens of courageous, visionary leaders, citizens who realized that when their politicians weren't exercising leadership, it was up to them. I'm so fascinated by what makes bad leaders inept, toxic, or sadistic, and good, like Faba and Lema, that I'm doing my doctorate in it. One of the key leadership theories is that leaders cannot exist without followers. Even authoritarian leaders need people following them. Their militaries, their political allies, and their citizens must comply with their control, even if it is enforced through fear. Fortunately, that isn't our reality in the same way that it was in Liberia. Without our voices telling our politicians what we need them to do, they are left in the echo chambers of Washington or Geneva, Monrovia or Moscow. Without our voices, they end up listening mainly to one another. Their leadership becomes derived more from their peers than from the people. This is the paradigm shift. How do we get our leaders to be better followers and us to be better leaders? How do we close the gap between our aspirations for our societies, our nation, and for the world, and our current reality? That gap is our leadership challenge. That gap may seem daunting, but it's not anywhere near as bad as it was, like Lema and Faba faced. At the end of the day, when we look at what opportunities we have to make sure that our politicians are listening to us 24/7, that we're the ones who are able to be their leaders and that they are listening to us, we may ask, what happened to leaders like Mandela, King, Shireen Ebadi, Wangari Maathai, Mother Teresa? People who didn't just stand up, they changed their societies. But they didn't do it alone. They harnessed people's frustrations, their hopes, their anxious agitation for change. We have forums right now that allow us to vote. We do it 100 times a day on social media. We express our likes and our dislikes, our opinions about where our country is going on Instagram and Snapchat, on Facebook and other social media. Yet when it comes to an election, we consider it incredible if we get just over half of the eligible voters out to the polls. How sad is that? Can you imagine what it would be like if we were as active politically as we are socially? But voting isn't enough. We have to think about ways in which our politicians can hear us 24/7. What can each of you walk out of here tonight and do to make your perspective known in Washington? You can vote, but exercising our leadership only once every 2 to 4 years in this country leaves a lot of time in between when our politicians are left alone in their echo chambers. So what about looking at constant communication? What does that look like when we're trying to get our politicians to listen to us? You could write an op-ed and try to influence public opinion. You could join a political party and try to change the system from within. Or, like Faba and Lema, you can start a protest. That may begin by just talking to a couple of friends, and then talking to a couple more. You never know where that could lead. Just ask Teresa Schuch, who woke up the morning after the 2016 election and typed up a Facebook post. She'd never been politically engaged, and yet through one small action, she hit on a nerve that prompted millions to join the Global Women's March. By doing something small, she prompted what's been called the largest protest movement in U.S. history that had 4 million people marching in the U.S. and over 130 marches worldwide. Which brings us back to the power of social media. For those of us who are change makers, looking to have our politicians listen to us 24/7, there's an app for that. It's called Countable, and it's a nonpartisan platform that allows everybody to read clear and succinct summaries of upcoming and active legislation. It allows us to vote, yay or nay, and directly tell our lawmakers how we want them to vote on these bills. Not everybody can drop everything and organize a protest. Not everybody wants to be a politician, and not everybody can get a piece published in the New York Times. But everybody can tap a screen. If we're going to be ranting to our friends on social media, we have no excuse not to be telling our politicians what we want them to be doing on an app. An issue that makes this real for me is school shootings. My husband and I both work at universities. We have a daughter in 3rd grade and a son in kindergarten. Since Sandy Hook, there have been more mornings than I care to remember when I've wondered if maybe today was the day that we shouldn't take them to school. There were mothers whose children went to Stoneman Douglas High School who support the Second Amendment, and fathers there who believe that AR-15s should be banned. But what they can both agree upon is that nobody wants to see their children gunned down in a classroom. So while we may have very different ideas of how that can be prevented, the only way our politicians are going to be able to develop effective policies is if they actually talk to the other side. It seems fitting that right now, it is the students who are stepping up to this challenge. After decades of partisan politics, they are telling our politicians, we're tired of your BS. If you're not going to lead on this issue, we are. We're at a moment in history. In many ways, in our hyper-connected age, we're becoming more divided than ever before. But what I want to leave you with tonight is that it would be futile to wait for a leader out there to save us from our current dysfunction. We are the ones who put our political representatives in power. They represent us. So now, perhaps more than at any other time, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Our political, social, and environmental destiny is in our hands. We have the duty and right to self-determination. It is ours to lead. Thank you.